Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Royal Navy was the preeminent naval power in the world, having the designers, industrial capacity, resources, capabilities, and ingenuity to create and maintain a large navy as well as a large merchant fleet. With this great power, the United Kingdom had the ability to create specialized ships that solved a niche problem, or experimental ships that paved the way for the future. Along with other experimental craft that didn't end up working out so well, one part of the Navy that some didn't respect at the start of the Great War was the submarine fleet. Soon, the Royal Navy would understand the power of these vessels and began to think about different ways they could use the submarine, coming up with some unique designs to say the least. In today's video, we'll cover some of those designs. The first vessel we are going to discuss is the interesting submarine X-1. Her origins derive from the First World War and just after as well, where Dr. Norman Ferryman, in his excellent book, British Submarines in Two World Wars, writes in 1915, with a large submarine program underway, a submarine design committee was convened to decide future policy. The first meeting, September 8, 1915, considered 6 alternative types: 1 coastal, 2 patrol, 3 fleet submarine, 4 cruiser submarine, 5 mine layer, and 6 monitor. The first 2 already existed. The value of 3 would be gauged after the first of the K-class K3 trials. 2 E-boats were already being converted to mine layers. The cruiser 4 was considered feasible, but it would have few targets. That cruiser submarine was an idea that the Royal Navy would continue to dabble with. And following the war, some thought it might be worthwhile experimenting with the concept. Where Dr. Ferryman continues, like other navies, the Royal Navy was much impressed by the large, long-range cruiser submarines the Germans introduced late in the First World War. Grand Fleet CNC Admiral Bay personally requested the DNC design one, and in a January 22, 1918 letter, he proposed construction that was impossible due to urgent wartime needs. But the idea resurfaced in December 1918. It made sense. A war against Japan would necessarily involve an attack on Japanese merchant shipping. Questions asked by the Post-War Questions Committee testified to continued interest. Initially, a British version of the wartime German cruiser using captured German engines seems to have been planned, but the project morphed. There was no question of ordering a prototype cruiser in 1919, not only because there was no money, but also because the board proposed at the Versailles Conference the British government should propose a ban on further submarine construction. The project came to life once that initiative had failed. Design work was underway by 1920. The Admiralty seems to have accepted the need for a big experimental submarine to test new technology. This role may explain the designation X-1 applied to the new submarine. Initially, the Admiralty didn't necessarily want to build submarines following the First World War, and none were included in the 5-year program, which was before the drastic cuts in the program due to the Washington Conference, which had not yet met. Anyway, the Director of Naval Construction already proposed sketches be prepared as a basis for future decisions, which interestingly enough, the power plant devised by the Germans in their U-139 class, a diesel-electric drive. The Admiralty initially planned to use those captured German diesels. Still, once it became clear that the cruiser submarine was seen as experimental, she became the test bed for the new Admiralty 3000 bhp diesels. German generator engines were still used presumably because there is no EW. Admiralty engine in that power range, taking from Dr. Friedman again in January 1921, RA's proposed beginning detailed design. It must soon have been clear that the experimental submarine would be the largest yet built. The initial sketch design seems to have called for a surface displacement of 2,300 tons. Undated detailed design data, probably compiled late in 1920, showed a surface displacement of 2,680 tons, which compared to the 2,130 tons for the largest late-war German UK cruisers, the abortive U-183 class, and 1,600 tons for the McGlass. Beam torpedo tubes were omitted because it was assumed that those in the bow tubes could be angled. The 3 4-inch guns would have been on individual turntables, and the submarine would have had a 9 SFT rangefinder and a director control tower, DCT. The upper part of the pressure hull plating would be strengthened as in the German UK cruisers, total thickness 1 inch. Initially, DNC planned to use 448 cells. a third more than in the largest British submarines to obtain a submerged speed of 10 knots. But some wanted to cut back to 336 to simplify electrical arrangements using larger cells. The director of Gunnery Division, DGD, wanted 6-in guns and spray shields. By March 1921, DGD had been argued back down to a twin experimental 5-in gun. DNC asking that the diameter of trunk it required not exceed that necessary for a twin 4.7-inch, which had presumably been designed, although no such gun yet existed. DNO wanted a high-angle gun, but DNC considered it of little value and it was never included in the designs. RA feared that DGD was trying to turn the big submarine into a gunnery experiment. Very secondary matter. He was willing to accept 5-in guns. EOC and Vicers were asked for gun designs. The DNC, which was used as tennis and Dane Court, by the way, a fascinating figure, emphasized the need for submerged control, quick diving, and underwater endurance, and on top of that, habitability, as it would be vital for a submarine with such long range. There were further debates about her guns, and it was decided she should carry twin 5.2 2-in mountings and gun controls, including a rangefinder and a director control tower. Because of all these revolutionary features, the submarine was to be called an experimental large submarine. Further changes were made to the design of the submarine, namely with the fuel tanks and the lines to make sure she would have good underwater qualities, and allow her to use her 6 bow torpedo tubes. Construction took much longer than the Admiralty. X-1 was laid down in November 1921 and commissioned in December 1925, successfully running power trials in March 1926. However, X-1 would have issues, and I think Dr. Freirigman sums up her short and undistinguished career very well. She was then the largest submarine in the world. She was considered a good seaboat and handled well, surface and submerged. However, she suffered from crippling engine trouble due to torsional vibration. Her critical range of revolutions, RPM, was unfortunately near that required to make full speed. Once completed, she was sent to Gibbler, but suffered serious engine trouble going out and returning. She was then returned to dockyard hands. She joined the Mediterranean fleet in 1927 after a successful full-power trial, but she suffered further engine trouble after a near full-power trial in January 1928. Although she was repaired in Malta, she suffered further trouble on her passage home in April 1928. She also experienced trouble with her auxiliary engines and with her HP air compressors, after which she spent most of her time in dockyards. In 1933, the board decided that given her age and her limited operational value, she was no longer worth keeping active. In December of that year, she was placed under dockyard control. Her main impact on the British fleet at that point was that she accounted for an unusually large fraction of the total allowance submarine tonnage. Under the 1930 London Treaty, she could not be scrapped until she was overage. In 1936, she was deleted from the list and scrapped in 1937, the London Naval Treaty having lapsed by that time. X-1 was an interesting concept and overall ship. Her appearance is also really odd. Her twin 5.2 2-in turrets are something you don't expect on a submarine. But then again, look at the M-Class M-Class. Speaking of which, next up in this video are those M-Class submarines which started life off in 1915. Next up in this video are the M-Class submarines which started life off in 1915. The Royal Navy was looking to experiment with submarines, and in a similar way to the Royal Navy monitors we have discussed previously in this series, along with a number of other ideas, where Dr. Norman Freirigman, in British Submarines in Two World Wars, writes in 1915 with a large submarine program. Underway, a submarine design committee was convened to decide future policy. The first meeting, 8th of September 1915, considered 6 alternative types: 1 coastal, 2 patrol, 3 fleet submarine, 4 cruiser submarine, 5 mine layer, and 6 monitor. The first 2 already existed, and the value of 3 would be gauged after the first of the K-Class K3 trials. 2 E-boats were already being converted to mine layers. The cruiser 4 was considered feasible, but would have few targets. A long-range submarine of this basic type would, however, be invaluable in connection with a blockade. That left only 6, the Monitor, for near-term construction. it would mount a single 12-in gun, in effect substituting for torpedoes. It would be used for a surprise attack, the submarines popping up and firing. It may be considered the very distant ancestor of submarine-launched anti-ship missiles. The Monitor submarine could also show places inaccessible to surface. Warships, which the one place they could do so on the German coast was Heeland. The committee in charge of the designs thought the 12-in gun was too large for the submarine, and thought a 7.5-in gun might be a better fit for these Monitor submarines. Through various back and forths between the submarine committee and the director of naval construction used as tennis and Dane court, the armament was decided. These Monitor submarines, or MiG-class submarines, were to be powerfully armed with a 12-in 40-caliber gun taken from an older battleship. Much like the 12-in Royal Navy Monitors, one 3-in high-angle gun and 4 torpedo tubes. The 12-in guns came from the formidable class pre-dreadnoughts, although spares for the battleships. There were debates about how large the submarine should be, with initial proposals being a larger version of the K-class hull. This being some 3,000 to 4,000 tons, a very large submarine indeed. All the debates led to a compromise of a modified J-class hull and a power plant of an L-class submarine. Taking from Dr. Friedman again, the big gun could elevate to 20 degrees and could train 20 degrees, 10 degrees in either bow. Its muzzle carried a watertight tampion controlled from the loading chamber. Like a torpedo tube, it would be aimed using the whole submarine. Although in this case, training offered some degree of correction, the gun was wet and it could be fired properly after a week on patrol when the submarine sometimes dived to 100 feet. After seeing a target at periscope depth, 28 feet, the submarine could reach the surface in 25 seconds, fire, and return to periscope depth in 15 seconds. One of the 2 main periscopes incorporated a rangefinder, and in addition to the usual pair of periscopes. A third was for gun control, with its eyepiece in a compartment behind the loading chamber. Surface seeping was particularly important, as handiness the gun could not traverse very far. Fear that the shock of firing would damage the batteries proved groundless. To ensure the massive gun didn't fail, the submarines had to be adapted to patrol work. Apart from the gun, the submarines had good underwater qualities, at least some of them. The design was complete in June 1916, and orders were started that year. The submarines were initially referred to as the Special KL class and designated K-18 through K-21. They were renamed M1 through M4 in April 1918. The first pair were designed with 18-inch torpedoes, the second pair with 21-inch. Construction was initially delayed for fear the Germans would build their own Monitor submarines, which would do far more damage than the British ones. However, construction was accelerated later, and M1 entered service in mid-1918, a vessel of a little under 1,600 tons on the surface and a top speed on the surface of 14.7 knots. Not great, as it was expected to reach 16 knots. The rest of the class were finished after the war and entered service in a new world, besides M4, which was broken up on the slipway, where, to quote Dr. Friedman once more, "The gun was never used operationally, and any idea of using a gun as a torpedo substitute died after the war." However, large submarines with good underwater qualities proved useful because they could be usefully converted for other test purposes. M2 became in effect a submarine aircraft carrier, and M3 a mine layer. The submarine survived the Washington Naval Treaty through a loophole that basically didn't look at the caliber of the submarine's guns. The submarine operated until late 1925, when N1 was sunk in an exercise when she was ran by a Swedish merchant ship. M2 and M3 were put in reserve and used for other roles. Starting in the early 1920s, there were some in the Royal Navy who wanted patrol submarines, and a great way to extend the range of those patrol submarines was to add an aircraft. Though remaining, M-class were perfectly suited for this experimental work, and specifically M2. Dr. Friedman writes about the conversion. The Air Ministry considered the project feasible, and it went ahead. Money for the submarine modification to M2 was provided in the 1925 to 1926 estimates. The Air Ministry pointed out anything short of a catapult would limit the aircraft to very low performance, and would also require considerable wind over the deck for a 50-feet run, typically 26 knots, far beyond submarine performance, nor would it be wise to re-embark the aircraft by floating it on board. As a fallback, M2 could use her crane to place the seaplane in the water so that it could take off under its own power. Completion for the conversion was initially set for May of 1926, but problems with the catapult and with the delivery of the hangar frames casting delayed it. Everything was all done in 1928, and on trials, N2 did 12.5 knots. She operated in this experimental role until January 1932, where she sank stern first and was found on the seabed with her hangar door and also the access hatch between the hangar and the submarine open. That was inconsistent with the sinking, and therefore it was determined that the sinking was most likely due to valves in the afterbass tank being inadvertently left open, with the hangar and hatch being open only exacerbating the issues, leaving us with one of the class left, N3. N3 was converted into a mine-laying submarine in the late 1920s with a great deal of difficulty. There were a number of trials with a number of failures, namely with the interior mine-laying equipment, where taking from Dr. Ferryman again, a submarine mine layer design was begun in 1924. It was soon clear that the mine layer could not possibly be ordered until 1924-1925 program. As of December 1925, work on designs for both internal and external mine layers was only at the stage of sketching mine arrangements. Drawings and estimates for the mine-laying tube for the internal mine layer had been submitted to the Admiralty. Once they have been approved, it would take 7 more months to complete the experimental tube. For the external mine layer, a single section of rails 100 feet long, capacity 25 mines, would be ready in January 1926. Meanwhile, the big submarine M3 was ordered converted into an external mine layer, i.e., with mines stowed outside her pressure hull. It was impossible to convert her into an internal mine layer because her pressure hull was not large enough. Given her large superstructure, she was fitted with 2 mine rails, the mines being moved down the rails by hydraulic jiggers. The alternative was a chain and rack system. The idea was first raised in 1923 by Captain Max Horton, 1st Submarine Flotilla, and was warmly supported by RAS, who gained approval despite objections from the technical departments. Once it had been approved, work on the internal mine layer was officially abandoned in 1925. RAS claimed various advantages for an external mine layer. Smaller surface displacement, 1,600 tons versus 2,500 tons. More mines, 100 versus 40. No sacrifice of internal space for mines. Maximum speed of laying to obtain 150 feet spacing, 15 knots versus 8 knots. Higher minimum speed, 2.5 knots versus 3.5 knots, due to smaller size, smaller compensating tanks, and no cooling plant required for mines carried internally. DTD objected to some of these claims, such as the great number of mines. Although the external mine layer would always carry more than the internal and the greater internal space, the external type required considerable space for mining machinery and compensating gear. Disadvantages not mentioned by the RAS were slow diving due to the large free-flooding superstructure, large silhouette, continuously immersed mines and sinkers which could not be maintained on passage, hence not as reliable as those kept internally, greater vulnerability of mines to depth charging, inability to clear a jam without surfacing, and limited mine-laying depth. 80 fathoms a 200-foot fathom design cannot be laid externally. A conference was held on concerning mine-laying submarines on November 2, 1927, and it was decided whether a design for an internal mine layer should be investigated now. If the M3 trials proved successful and other important details, but the gist of the meeting was the future of mine-laying submarines hinged on the success of the M3 trials. The plans for such a mine-laying submarine were formalized due to concerns about a war with Japan in the Far East. The submarine would operate from Hong Kong, about 1,500 nautical miles away. From the most distant of the 20 places to be mined, 10 mines per month would be laid off 14 important points, and 5 mines per month off 8 less important ports, a total of 100 per month, calling for 6 submarines, each carrying 40 mines, But again, it depends on the trials of M3, of which, in March 1928, the DNC was frustrated with the heavy workload of the submarine section, including the work to convert M3, which would be completed later that year, where in the coming years, more discussions about the viability of mine-laying submarines was discussed, of course, depending on the trials of M3. If you didn't get that part by now, taking some Dr. Friedman, the chief question was probably whether mines would survive exposure over an extended mission. For a final test, M3 spent 33 days, including some severe weather, at sea, and the landmines both surfaced and submerged. The test proved that her special mine-laying equipment and mines and sinkers could stand up to extended wartime missions. Some problems with depth-taking were attributed to minor design flaws in the mines. Controller described M3 as a good mine layer but a bad submarine. The future mine-laying submarine also had to be a good submarine. The M3 trials convinced RAS that for good diving qualities, the future external mine layer should have a single row of mines in a greatly reduced casing, given that great attention was paid to the shape of the casing, especially its after end. The silhouette should be as low as possible. Surface speed need not exceed 15 knots. 6 bow tubes were desirable, but 4 could be accepted. ASDICs and good wireless transmission were definite requirements, but a gun was not. Still, with the new rules of the London Naval Treaty, the Malines submarines had to be scrapped, and N3 was therefore scrapped in the early conclusion 1930s. There are so many other weird and wacky submarines out there, especially for the Royal Navy. Of course, we will cover weird Japanese and American submarines, as there are a number of them out there. This is a fun series that I definitely intend on continuing. Hopefully you all enjoy it too. If you have any submarine in particular you would like me to cover in the future, please put it down in the comments. Anyway, thanks for watching everyone. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great day.